Hello everybody and welcome to another video on Chess Master Games. This is Capablanca versus Scott in the Hastings tournament of 1919. And this game is a Slav actually. It starts d4, d5, c4, c6. So already black is showing that he wants to build a solid structure and is trying to neutralize any advantage white has. Capablanca continues, nice f3, nice f6, and e3. So this move is a slow move that builds up for white. It's not passive, but it just is not the most aggressive move that white can play. Bishop f4 and bishop g5 are both playable, but here what Capablanca may be planning is to put the c1 bishop onto b2, fianchettoing it. So he's leaving options open, and black now plays e6. So this is known as a pawn triangle, b7 to d5 to f7, sort of a triangle of pawns. And the idea is just to safeguard d5 and be able to recapture with a pawn and still have a pawn chain, as well as allowing black to usually develop a few pieces and then do a pawn break, which will be either c5 or e5, which may then counter white's pawns on the fourth rank, and may give black enough room to maneuver and prevent white from having a dominating space advantage. Knight b d2 is played, and the reason I think this is played rather than knight c3 is that while both guard the e4 square, and knight c3 does attack d5, so it does create more pressure, d2 is more of a square for maneuvering. So the knight on f3 could go to e5, and then the d2 knight could go to f3 to back up the knight on e5, as well as defending c4. So if black takes on c4, white can recapture with the knight. Again, e5 is a very key square here. Black is slightly weak on the dark squares due to the majority of his pawns in the center all being on light squares. So white's control of the dark squares and occupation of the dark squares may be the idea here. Knight b d7, so hitting the dark squares. Bishop d3. So white's developed, interesting, and black mirrors with bishop d6. So the only difference in position is that white's pawn on the c-file has moved 2 squares while black's has moved 1 square. And before undertaking any central plans, white just coordinates pieces better and develops by castling, putting the king in a safe place. Black does likewise. And now what's interesting is that white takes quite an aggressive approach here. White is the one who does the pawn break with e4. So the first thing we can see is white is threatening e5, forking the bishop and knight. It's also attacking d5, so challenging the front of the pawn chain, and also giving white a little bit more of a space advantage. It also allows the c1 bishop to perhaps later move to f4 or g5. And it's also, because it's opening up the center, it's clear that white is going to try and use the advantage in space to develop more easily and more flexibly, and therefore to create an initiative with the better developed pieces. So black takes and white recaptures. With the knight, white wants to keep the light square bishop for a future attack. And now black takes, and after the recapture, what do you think black did in this position? Well, the thematic move, and well done if you said this, is to break. So e5 might not be the best option here, but c5 looks very good for black. And after bishop c2, just getting the bishop out of harm's way, black can develop the queen. White can then develop his own queen and threaten checkmate. And here black can actually try and strike in the centre with f5, controlling the central square e4, blocking the queen and bishop battery on h7, and potentially building a nice pawn structure. Rook d1 is likely to be played, and then takes, queen takes, bishop c5. So now the bishop has used the square c5 to become very active. And Capablanca in his notes gives queen h4, and then he comments that knight f6 would give black a good game here. While that's true, I think he might have missed that black has an even stronger continuation with knight e5, potentially taking on f3 and doubling white's pawns. And here there's probably going to be quite a few swaps, where black's advantage is going to be on the king's side, and he should fairly soon be able to play both e5 and e4. So potentially the kingside majority could be very useful for black. Anyway, going back to the game position, having seen that, black's move doesn't really make a lot of sense because he plays knight f6, a so-called natural move, but he's not using the sort of theme of the position, the general idea. So this so-called natural move, or developing move that gains a tempo, is actually not very good. White retreats the bishop, which he was planning to do anyway, and now I can't see a good way for black to proceed here. A move like c5 might not be that good due to d5, and also bishop g5 as well might be even stronger, pinning the knight. So after b6, aiming to break with c5 a bit later, queen d3. So white is developing pieces, but also using his trumps, his advantages. So white's advantage is the space and better mobility of the pieces. So what white can do is create the threats and start gaining the initiative, and it attempts also to cause problems for black and prevent black from carrying out their plan. I mean, we've already seen that the c5 break is a very thematic idea in lines like the Slav or the Karakan, but it also prevents just natural development. With a move like bishop b7, white can create a devastating threat here. Can you see what white could play to give him a very good advantage? Yeah, well, you may have noticed that queen takes h7 is not exactly possible due to knight takes the queen, which would win. So what white can do here is bishop g5. And now, if black wants to prevent checkmate, then there aren't really that many good choices. A move like g6 just weakens the dark squares, and I think Capablanca would have been very happy to see that move. Even h4 and then h5 from white could be played to try and do a hack attack. So the best move might be rook e8, and then white can win a pawn with bishop takes knight, queen takes, and queen takes h7 check. So I would definitely take white in this position. This looks very strong. Going back, so black can't really play bishop to b7. Instead, h6 is played to prevent bishop g5. So white uses the opportunity of black not developing and being a little bit behind to reroute the bishop on c1. It can't now go to any good square on the c1 to h6 diagonal. So instead, we're going to finkesso it, and again put pressure against black's knight on f6. And even the move h6 has very slightly weakened the king side for black. The light squares are slightly weaker now. So after queen e7, it's a good move. I prefer bishop c7 actually, but small thing. Bishop b2, and again, the one problem is that if say black plays bishop a3 to try and swap off, I don't think he has enough time for it, because white can again try and threaten the knight on f6 by playing bishop takes bishop, queen takes, knight e5, and the plan here is, if say bishop b7 to protect the pawn, can you see what white could play here? Well, there's either knight g4 hitting the knight, but the move I like a bit better, just because it creates more of a threat, is knight d7. But not a big deal. So knight g4, rook e8, knight takes, pawn takes, and look at the kingside structure, it's terrible. Queen h7, king f8, and white can win a pawn here with queen takes h6, and then black's king is now stuck in the center, so white could get an excellent game here. And being a pawn up as well, I think white is practically won already. So that is something to watch out for. It wasn't played in the game though. Instead, rook d8 was played. So sensible move. Again, the c5 break, it could be good for black if he had enough time. So c5 and then take on d4, and then perhaps the rook on the d file could potentially create threats against the white queen. So rook a d1 is played, and now just before c5, black plays bishop b7, so connecting the rooks, putting the bishop on the long diagonal, it all looks good. And now a fantastic move from Capablanca. Rook f e1. So before he does what he's planning, which is going to be revealed very soon, he just connects all the sort of threats together. He puts the rooks on the semi-open files, and there's lots of different motifs now available with all his pieces developed. So after rook a c8, so black's also developing the rest of his pieces. Now is the time to improve our pieces that have already been developed. So here, knight h4 is played. I love this move. And although the computer doesn't give it much of a look, slowly it begins to see that white has a big advantage. And the reason for that is that because of rook fe1, the e-pawn is pinned. Black's queen is potentially under threat. Again, this is one of the one of the good things about putting your rook on the line, same line as the enemy queen. So many tactical opportunities become available. So White again is using the kingside attack as his trump card, as his main idea to gain an advantage. So his bishops are pointing at the king side. The rook's in the centre, very useful. The queen also is lined up with the bishop, pointing at the king side. So we just need to use our knight effectively. So here, if black were to try and swap off with bishop a3, there's a horrible crush here with knight f5. So now the knight going to f5 is very often an incredibly strong piece in a kingside attack. And here, queen f8, and black gets completely slaughtered now with knight h6 check, takes, then bishop takes bishop, deflecting the queen away from defending on the king side. So now black's pieces are looking rather unsupportive. Rook takes e6, so we're now just blasting apart the rest of black's defense. And if pawn takes rook, queen g6, and now it's just one for white. It's going to be checkmate very, very soon after king f8, queen takes knight check, king e7, c5. So we're cutting off black's retreat with the queen. If queen takes e6, then queen e7 might have been okay for black. But now, if, say, rook c7, trying to protect the king along the 7th rank, queen takes e6 check, rook e7, queen g8, and it looks like the king's just about to escape, but no. Bishop f5 check, king c7, and what can white play here to checkmate in 3 moves? Yeah, so it's at first glance it looks like a very unnatural move, retreating in order to attack, but it's very strong. Queen g3 check, and now that stops the king going back to b8 and escaping, and there's nowhere for the king to go. So rather unfortunately, rook e5, and then after queen takes, rook d6, and queen takes checkmate. I've left out rook e5 because it doesn't really add anything. So checkmate would have been achieved. So going back, again, yeah, look at, so knight f5 is a very strong threat, and I'm not sure black played the best move, but it is very hard to find a good move here. Bishop b8 was played, and now this is quite typical of a master like Capablanca. He just wants to prevent any possible counterplay from black. So there's no bishop takes h2s or queen c7 attacking h2. There's no counterattack. And this is very complicated because there seem to be so many options for black, such as the c5 break. But white's pieces are so well coordinated and ready to jump in and attack. Yet black's pieces, even though they're similar in terms of they're almost a mirror of white's pieces, the black pieces can't really coordinate. Black's still too cramped. He hasn't ever broken with c5 or e5 and been able to maneuver the pieces in a more flexible way. And this is one of the very strong advantages that Capablanca has used here, the space advantage. White has been able to maneuver the pieces into better positions quicker than black because he has an extra rank to put the pieces onto. So after king f8, trying to prevent any quick checkmates, queen f3, and here, if c5 finally breaking, white has a very strong response. Can you find it? Yeah, just d5. So that's the other break in this position. Black can break with c5 and sometimes e5, whereas in this sort of position, with the pawn structure like you see now, white is constantly trying to engineer the d5 break to really grab even more space, and often the d5 break is associated with some sort of tactic as well. So d5 would unveil the attack on the knight from the bishop on b2. So black didn't play c5, instead he played king back to g8. Perhaps he was hoping for a draw with queen d3 and then king f8 again. But now, knight f5. So the queen goes to c7. And now the knight could be taken on f5. But knight takes h6 is played. Check. So if black takes, then queen takes f6 just looks deadly, as well as d5 breaking and threatening queen g7 checkmate. So king f6 was king f8 was played, and now, again, I said it was associated with there being a tactical sequence. d5 is played, so it looks as though white may be losing a pawn here because black has two pawns, a bishop, a rook, and a knight all on d5. So that's 5 pieces controlling d5. White only has a pawn, a queen, and a rook. So you need as many defenders as you have as there are attackers. But after c takes d5, white now has the tactic bishop takes f6. So again, it's removing another defender of the black king, and it's also a forcing move, which is a capture. Forcing moves are captures or checks. So this does force black to respond, and neither capture is very pleasant. If pawn takes the knight, then instead of just winning the exchange, white can go on a rampage with the queen and play queen h5. And there are so many checkmating ideas here that I don't think black has any response that can stave off the threats. If king e8, then rook takes e6 check can be played, as the pawn on f7 will be pinned. And if king g8, then queen takes h6 mates. And if black moves another piece here, then queen takes h6 will probably still mate. So it's very hard to find any move for black. Instead, though, the pawn took the bishop, and now the queen takes the pawn. So the queen and knight are combining very well. That's often something you find, even in endgames. The queen and knight can link up and checkmate the king if they're in quite aggressive positions. So, okay, queen takes f7 isn't being threatened due to the presence of the black queen on the 7th rank. But after king e8, trying to shift the king over to be better protected by the rest of the black forces, rook takes e6. Again, it's sometimes called a clearance sacrifice, where you're just giving up material in order to remove the defense around the enemy king. Though I wouldn't call it a clearance sacrifice. I've only heard a few people call it that. I just call it a sacrifice. But here, after the basically obligatory capture, f takes e6, white now has queen takes, king f8, queen f6 check, king e8, rook e1 check. And now, after king d7, rook e7 mate. So I find that quite funny that black's pieces are now all in a 2x3 rectangle here, while white's pieces are just dominating the board. So, oh, also of note is that bishop f5 is also checkmate, which I think is more fitting to have more white pieces participating in the checkmate, as well as queen e6. So there are several checkmates here. So I hope you enjoyed this game. Hope you got something from it in terms of attacking and using your trumps, your advantages, to make a plan and create threats and win the game. So comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.